As the fight for Medicare for all continues, and as it becomes more and more a part of the mainstream political conversation, the question becomes, how do we get it done? What should it look like? The Bernie Sanders bill, which now has 16 Democratic co-sponsors, does a number of things that might be startling to people who expected we would continue with the health insurance status quo. Our next guest has written a couple of very good pieces about Medicare for all in general and about one aspect of it in particular, so I'm looking forward to discussing it with her. Natalie Shure is the story producer for Adam Ruins Everything, which is a program on True TV. She is also a writer and researcher who has been published in a number of great places, including The Atlantic, BuzzFeed, Slate, The Daily Beast, The Los Angeles Times, Salon. We could go on, but you get it. She's been published a lot, and health is one of her areas of expertise. So first of all, Natalie, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, of course, there were two things I wanted to talk to you about in particular. One was your piece entitled Medicare for All Would Be Difficult to Enact. It would also be difficult to dismantle. But before we get to that, let's talk about the nature of Medicare for All. You have a piece in Jacobin magazine called Down with the Copay. Let's talk about that for a second. The copays, of course, are the out-of-pocket costs that people incur when they go to the doctor, and as you leave, the doctor's office takes $15 or $20 or $40, keeps going up. At least in my experience, when you go to the pharmacy, they do the same, or when you get a medical test. What's wrong with the copay?
Well, what we know about copays from a number of studies is that they do make people see the doctor less. And I think that economists and people who support the use of them tout this as, a major plus, that this is a way to keep costs down. But we also know that it seriously affects low-income people in a way that's disproportionate with the way that it affects higher-income people, and that it actually ends up having worse health outcomes for lower income people as a result. I think that the idea that we need copays to control costs is pretty seriously undermined by the fact that we don't see wealthy people going to the doctor every time they stub their toe, which I think is one of the main arguments for copays in the first place. So it really doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
That's a fantastic point. It's actually, I used to work, first of all, in private sector health insurance. I'll spend a lifetime trying to expiate that sin, but also in health policy. And I used to have this argument with people that going to the doctor is actually not a fun thing to do. It's not the ideal way to spend a Tuesday afternoon. Right? And your point about wealthy people is extremely well taken. There was also a study back, I think it was in the 80s, by the Rand Corporation that purported to find that the health care that people avoid because of copayments and deductibles, and we should talk about deductibles too, but that the health care that they avoid doesn't affect the outcome, that somehow there's no negative consequence to all of this. People don't do without needed treatment. And in fact, studies have pretty conclusively shown that Americans with health insurance do go without needed treatment, haven't they?
Absolutely. I think that, the RAND study, people take that away from it, showing that there were, not significant changes. That didn't apply to lower income earners. It did show pretty decisively that for people with less money, copays really did have negative health consequences. I think it's, pretty intuitive that someone with very little discretionary income is not going to go to the doctor as easily. And there are also some studies, at one point when California added copays to its Medicaid program, there were fewer people going to the doctor, and then those savings were offset in higher rates of hospitalization because people did put off visiting the doctor, and then their health problems got worse.
You know, Natalie, you're a writer as well as somebody who follows health policy. So I can't help but think that the entire belief system that's been built among policymakers and the private sector people and all that around the copayment isn't somehow another kind of demonization of the least powerful people in the system. That there's something in it that says that left to their own devices, it's kind of like the weird inversions of moral hazard we saw as a principle we saw in the housing bubble and its aftermath. It sort of suggests that left to their own devices, working Americans will just fritter away our national wealth on CAT scans and I don't know, whatever else, blood tests and so on. And it just strikes me that it's a cultural problem. It's almost the anthropology of the powerful against the powerless. Does that make any sense to you at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're right on. I think that that's definitely a motivation. You know, the idea that we're going to keep costs down in our healthcare system by putting pressure on individual patients is a ridiculous notion in the first place. One of the major problems with our healthcare system and why there are runaway costs is because there are very few mechanisms that actually work with the source of why these prices are so high. And prices aren't high because, you know, people are using the healthcare system like an old country buffet. And I think you're right on when you say that people put off going to the doctor. People don't like it. Even healthy people who can afford it. You know, if I have a little bit of a scratchy throat, I'm not going to go in that day. I have things to do. I'm going to put it off. I'm going to think about it a little while. And if it gets serious, of course I'll go in. I'm going to make that choice, and I'm lucky enough to be able to do so. But for the most part, you know, the idea that cost control should be an individual responsibility is a deeply conservative notion. And it's not one that I think a lot of liberals really think about. I think that people don't see that in the same way, and they don't think that they're imposing, you know, this test to avoid moral hazards. But that's absolutely what they're doing.
Yeah, I well said. And again, we're talking with Natalie Shure about copays in health insurance. And if you look at the studies of developed countries, OECD studies, and so on, they always say that Americans huge numbers of Americans in the middle class as well as lower income report having put off needed medical care in the past year. So that really underscores your point. And, you know, you, by the way, in your article on the copay, in your Jacobin article, again, it's called Down with the Copay, you use the phrase that is guaranteed to make me see red. And it's a liberal phrase. But before I get to that, it's a neoliberal phrase, I should say. But before I get to that, we talked about, I remember just kind of cowering in misery when first John Edwards and then Hillary Clinton introduced in the 2007-2008 Democratic primary the notion that healthcare is a shared responsibility and therefore you needed an individual mandate so that people would buy private sector health insurance. Whenever I think the words shared responsibility, I think progressive taxation under a reasonably and democratically socialized system of medicine. I don't think shared responsibility is a system where you give your money to for-profit organizations under compulsion. That's a little bit of a diversion, but I don't know your thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. I think that any healthcare system that charges money at the point of service, so, you know, requires an actual exchange of cash up front to receive medical service is going to harm lower income people and is going to favor the rich. You know, I think that we all share responsibility for a lot of societal responsibilities. But you're right, that the proper avenue for that is taxation, not extremely regressive cost-sharing measures imposed by companies.
Exactly. And now to the phrase that you quote in your piece that is, how do I put it? It's like the old Abbott and Costello routine about Niagara Falls, where it brings out some sort of homicidal mania. And that phrase, for me personally, and that phrase is skin in the game.
Yes, I thought you.
Yeah, is that what you thought I was going for? Yeah. Yeah, so let's talk about that for a second. Skin in the game. Is that a phrase that needs to be retired forever?
Yeah, I mean, it gets me as angry as it makes you. I mean, the idea that people want to, go to the hospital and just get any procedure they can, regardless of whether or not they need it, just because they don't pay fees up front at the point of service, strikes me as completely ridiculous on its face. And I think that the only reason that people don't talk about how ridiculous it is more often is because it's a claim made about poor people and not rich people. And as I said at the beginning, I think that the clearest way of our seeing that, the skin in the game idea is silly is that, someone who can afford all of those copays and deductibles without, batting an eye, they're not overusing the healthcare system. So if we can trust the discretion of super wealthy people to not get 7 MRIs they don't need for no reason, I think that we can trust low-income people to do the same thing.
Really well said. And again, and I'll try to find, we'll try to find and send you that Abbott Costello routine about Niagara Falls, because slowly I turn step by step, because globally search and replace that with skin in the game, and you got me. So before I let you go, Natalie Shure, Medicare for All would be difficult to implement. I think we all agree on that. I think some of us disagree with the prevailing wisdom that says it's difficult, therefore let's not bother trying, which seems to be the insider view nowadays. But I love this point about it being difficult to dismantle. I always say, people used to say anything more than the Affordable Care Act was politically impossible. I think anything less than Medicare for All in the long run is politically impossible to protect. And I think that was the point you were making. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's right on. I think that, especially coming out of these repeated Republican attacks on the ACA and attempts to sabotage or dismantle it, I think a lot of people had this argument that, it's not time to talk about Medicare for All because we need to focus on protecting the ACA, which in the short term is, of course, true. And I think that any single payer healthcare advocate would say the same thing. But the fact is, the structure of the ACA makes it uniquely easy compared to certainly single payer and compared to other healthcare systems as well. It makes it easier to dismantle. There really are a number of ways that different parts of the government can hit at this law to make it ineffective, because the project of balancing the interests of patients and for-profit insurance companies, for-profit providers, for-profit pharmaceutical companies, that's an extremely difficult dance, because it's very hard to make the math work and make the logic behind making all of those people happy work. And ultimately, it's not going to work. And so you have a much more precarious system than you would otherwise. And I think it's really instructive to look at the fact that the parts of the ACA that were the most passionately defended were parts that would be in a single payer system. I mean, certainly, the Medicaid expansion inspired some of the most visible activism that we saw. A lot of the really fantastic civil disobedience coming from groups like ADAPT, who protested and got arrested in lawmakers' offices. I think that goes to show that when people have this program, when they benefit from it, obviously, Medicaid isn't a universal entitlement, but for people of certain categories, it is. And so it's, more broadly applied and more of a public program than anything else in the ACA. I think that when people have those things, they're want to defend them. And I think you could also look at, the stability of the ACA and its, definitely its future outlook is in question. And you compare that to programs like Medicare and Social Security. And I think it's pretty obvious that unified, robust systems that benefit massive swaths of people are politically untouchable compared to their counterparts. So that seems to me to be, a point that people should be thinking about more.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you throw into the mix on the political side, the fact that we're seeing at this very moment, Trump and his allies attack elements of the Affordable Care Act as a bailout for insurance companies, which in a sense they are. They're certainly income for insurance companies. That's a political vulnerability. If you attack the fact that a lot of people can't make their mandated payments without difficulty, that's a vulnerability. If you add to the fact that even quote unquote good health insurance in society today, in our system today, is very expensive for people when given copays and deductibles and the premium costs and so on, that's a vulnerability. So I couldn't agree with you more. So Natalie Shure, author of these two pieces on Medicare for All being difficult to dismantle and Down with the Copay, thanks for your excellent written thoughts on this, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a great time.